Hi, I'm Mick Fealty, founding editor of Slugger Cato. Welcome to the Slugger Cato project, episode 3. Now, before I introduce today's guest, a little recap on some of the more interesting and insightful comments we've been getting on Slugger to previous episodes. I'm going to start with Sergeant Patrick Harper, I guess not his real name, and his rather exaggerated pronouncement of the death of democracy. He focuses on China. Free from electoral cycles, Chinese policymakers can pursue long-term strategic initiatives spanning decades, such as belt and road infrastructure investments or systematic industrial policy, without ever having to face the pressure to deliver immediate results for re-election. Although I guess, he writes, ending up on a gulag also focuses the mind too. Necromany's response was both enlightening and I think informative. The interesting thing on China is that the old Chinese civil service exams were the oldest exams in the world. When the Western powers started to take bites of China, they forced the Chinese state to abolish them. So China's tradition for competence in government and administration goes back a lot further than the Communist Party, and millennia even. And I think for the next few quotes, I'm going to talk about some things that expats have said. It's worth quoting Irish Londonderry here from the first interview with Paul Frew. The need for a constant 24-hour cycle in which in turn feeds a need for a constant supply of opinionated talking heads, and the more extreme the opinion, the better. This leads people to believe that the world is in a constant state of crisis and provides a confirmation to the old adage, that a lie can go halfway around the world before the truth has even got its boots on. I think that's Mark Twain, Londoner. Coming back to the core subject, another emigre, Cork man in London again, has this to say. In a system where both advisors and elected representatives can be judged on results over 5 to 10 years, it's possible that natural selection will weed out the duds and the fakes and then promote the real talent. But Northern Ireland doesn't have that process of selection. It really doesn't matter how good or how bad anyone is, because voting is not shaped by that. It's the old loyalties that shape it instead. And from the point of view of commenters, the last word to Mancunian and Deb. Thankfully not from London, but living in Northern Ireland. And I would say that something I've found peculiar to Northern Ireland politics, the civil servants here are very much front and centre, often, but I would say not always, by their own choices and needs to be in the limelight. It is not their job. They are supposed to advise and be neutral in the background. Councillors and MLAs are the public faces of government. In Great Britain, asking a member of the public to name the chief executive of their own council, they would look at you blankly. And she goes on to talk about Patsy. She says, look, Patsy's 100% correct. It is a vocation and not a job, and nor should it be. Or it should be. Unfortunately, for quite a number of politicians, it's seen as a soft career choice, and one from which many are totally unsuited to the day-to-day business of dealing with people who are often in dire straits. Thanks to all of those commenters and those that I haven't read out. Just to remind you, the Slugger Cato project wants to inspire and even demand rebelliousness, independence, honesty and courage from our backbenchers and councillors, not as a moral virtue, but as the essential tool needed to challenge and fix a floundering government system. Now, if you know of an MLA that we've missed so far, or a councillor who fits this bill, drop me a line at editor@sluggerotoole.com. Now, let's hear from our next witness, the Independent MLA for East Londonderry. Yes, that's its official name, Claire Sugden.
I suppose it's recognising and utilising your tools, those tools to your advantage. So, for example, debates in the chamber. Yes, I can take part in a debate, but I can't control or lead that debate because of the DeHunt system and the fact that I'm always usually the last to speak, and more often than not, I'll get timed out before they even get to me. So it's about identifying those tools that I do have control over. So for example, every MLA can submit 5 written questions per day, 25 per week, and that's how I very much try to drive my priority areas, my interests, the interests of my constituents, because I can submit that, and in doing so, that's raising those issues very, very specifically. Member statements, it's a relatively new parliamentary mechanism where any MLA can rise in their place and stand up and talk about any issue. Again, it's at the discretion of the Speaker whether he picks me or not, but there's 2 opportunities to do that per week. So I try to prepare something weekly in the hope that I may get to say something at least every other week. Yeah, so the member statement, they happen at the beginning of business. So on a Monday, that's usually around 12 o'clock if there's not a matter of the day or other business item. On a Tuesday, again, it'd be around 10:30. So as I say, it's within my gift to talk about any given issue, and this week in particular I spoke about Alzheimer awareness, given that it's Alzheimer Awareness Month and my interest around older people. I suppose outside of the parliamentary mechanisms, I'm an MLA, there's a level of clout to that. When I contact a public body or a statutory agency, they will listen and they will respond, and they tend to do that quicker than if I didn't have MLA at the end of my name. So I do utilise that clout, if you like, to give context to issues, to really explain why this is not working in terms of policy, what we need to do better, how it impacts my constituents on the ground. And it's something that I'm quite proud of. I utilise that tool, if you like, very often. And I tend to get good response, not always. But if you don't get a good response, you can always write back and pursue it in a way to really kind of keep on top of the issue. That happens in a relatively behind closed doors space. But then my next kind of tool is that if I don't get what I'm looking for, I can then, write a press release. I can raise it publicly to try and put that public pressure. So those tools in themselves. So with every written question I write, for every debate I speak, alongside that, we prepare a press release, we prepare a social media post, potentially more pursuant questions, just to try and ensure that there's ongoing momentum around an issue, particularly if we're looking for a certain outcome. And aside from that being a mechanism to hold government ministers to account, to raise issues, to represent, it also is a point of reference in terms of where we eventually need to go with that, is preparing the ground for potentially legislation if that's what's required. So I think it's about understanding your tools, recognising that there is, all of them within this assembly, and we utilise them as much as possible where it's efficient to do so. And I do think my efficiency compared with the largest political party will be different. So it's not always in my interest to be responding to every debate. I could be using that time using other tools, and I find certainly for me it's been quite successful to be selective about that, and and what actually gets what I'm looking for. Sure, I've been working on an issue recently in relation to osteoporosis. And it essentially came from having a conversation with a consultant in my constituency area who was highlighting the lack of service essentially that exists here, and why we should be concerned about that as politicians, not just in my area but right across Northern Ireland. So osteoporosis as an issue tends to mainly affect women because it's related to hormonal cycles in different stages within their life. But she informed me that within my constituency area we only have, I think it's 5 consultant appointments per month, which actually represents the biggest geographical area in Northern Ireland, and also one that has most women of a certain age, and this is very specific, an age-related type of condition. Compare that with the Belfast Trust, which has 50 appointments per week. So there's a clear indifference in the service, despite the fact that the population would indicate that the need is greater in my area. So I could have submitted a number of Assembly questions in relation to that, and I certainly will. I'll do that as a follow-up to other work that I've done, but I felt it was important to put this into greater context, so explain why this isn't working, the impact of it not working, not just to the individuals themselves, my constituents, but actually the wider public services. You know, you only have to go into the A&E department to see most of the beds being taken up by older people, probably because they've had a fall. Now, they've had a fall because it's the first stage of osteoporosis, or at least an awareness around that. Had we done screening work, prevention services, maybe they would not have fallen, they wouldn't have taken up that hospital bed, and that pressure would be a little less in that A&E department. So I was trying to look at it not just from its own issue, but also a more holistic approach. You can't really represent that in an Assembly question. It does take that context and that approach. That led to actually an event in the Assembly just last week, which I was able to sponsor again as an MLA. That in itself is going to lead to another event on World Osteoporosis Days to kind of bring this to the attention of more MLAs, because it will undoubtedly affect their constituents, because Northern Ireland is an ageing population, and it's a women's health issue as well, which again has never been properly serviced across Northern Ireland. So in that respect, so the Minister did give me a response, not at all happy with it. I will go back and I will put pressure on him, because in my correspondence I actually highlighted discrimination law. Because when you have an issue that disproportionately affects one of the protected groups, in this case women, and you're not providing the service appropriately, you could argue that there's a form of indirect discrimination. So I asked him, had they done an equality impact assessment? You know, is he going to uphold the law in relation to this? Didn't really get much back, but then that will push me to pursue this further. I will then put it into the public domain, because again, I'm not happy with that, and I may then follow that up with Assembly questions, with press. So it's not just about what we can do under the standing orders here, it's about how we create that package to really highlight, represent an issue, and hopefully then get actions in respect of it. I remember at the time being asked, will Claire Sugden be able to do this role because she's an independent, and someone responded in saying yes, because she has 3,000 plus civil servants who will help her do that job. It was interesting for me. I'm a student of politics, so I very much understand, I suppose, the dynamic between the government and the Parliament, if you like, and what the purpose of the Parliament is versus the government. And you know, I went from being a backbench MLA whose job it was to hold government ministers and their departments to account by asking questions and raising issues where I felt I should, to then be a member of that government. And I took that responsibility very seriously. I was keen to ensure that we did have a collective responsibility as a government, so you would never have found me briefing outside of my parties in government, because I didn't feel it was appropriate and I didn't feel it was responsible. And again, I suppose I always approached it from the perspective of that I wasn't there to lead a Department of Civil Service in what they wanted to do. I was there to scrutinise that department from within, and also set a direction on the basis of what I believe was best for the people of Northern Ireland. And it was an interesting dynamic, and to an extent I believe it was because civil servants, for all the years of direct rule, were ultimately performing the jobs of politicians, where they were the ones setting the direction, and they were the ones, who were tasked with coming up with the policy and the strategies moving forward. So I think then when you put a politician into that mix, sometimes they maybe don't appreciate that that's no longer their role. And they don't necessarily appreciate that I'm there not to represent myself or even my politics. I'm there to represent the views of the public. And I do get a little bit frustrated sometimes, because I think sometimes politicians don't see that it's actually their job to be the buffer between the people and the system, and that system being the civil service and what they would want to do in terms of public services. So I think that dynamic was difficult, because they pushed back a lot on me. They couldn't quite maybe get their head around who I was and what I represented, because I'm not a political party. I don't have a website full of policies. If anything, I took each issue as I found it. and I considered it on the basis of as many opinions as possible. And those opinions for me weren't within a room of civil servants, they were from stakeholders outside of this place. It was from people on the ground and listening to that. And even that, I think, sometimes was difficult for civil servants because they couldn't appreciate that that's where we had to be guided from. It was interesting for me. If anything, I regret that I wasn't able to really fulfill that role. It didn't last as long as I would have liked. But I learned a lot from it, and I appreciated the realities of the system. To an extent, it's easy to be a backbench politician and criticise and not be mindful of a budget, not be mindful of competing priorities, not be mindful of issues that you kind of need to deal with, that kind of come up unexpected. It's easy to say, let's invest in this, and it's easy to say, let's throw money at that. But there isn't an infinite money tree. There isn't an infinite amount of time. Mandates should last 5 years, and in Northern Ireland they tend to last a lot less. So you do have to take a strategic approach. You do have to take a holistic, all-encompassing approach. And I certainly, from my perspective, I was never wanting to make decisions that I knew would have a negative impact on someone else. So, if anything, I was a little bit constrained in trying to be all things to everyone, which realistically you can't be. And certainly as a backbench MLA, you can ask for those things, but there is a reality to that post. I must admit, when I saw civil servants, permanent secretaries, presenting themselves publicly, even in that guise, it frustrated me because their job is not to be that public-facing role. Their job is not to represent the people, because they've no mandate to do that. And I think that's the important difference between politicians and civil servants. They are there to ensure that we keep within the books, that we keep within legislation and policy, and that we are ultimately fulfilling the day-to-day running of Northern Ireland from a very, very practical perspective. But I suppose where I found civil servants weren't maybe quite as willing to appreciate what the role of a politician was in the department. And their role was to represent the people. It wasn't just about ensuring we kept to the bottom line. It was ultimately about providing a public service that improved people's lives as much as possible. It was about understanding their perspectives, which, to be honest, you couldn't do when you're sitting in a government department in Belfast. You had to get on the ground and you had to speak to those people, and it couldn't just be the same group of people that you spoke to every time to tick a box. You had to understand it from a rural perspective. You had to understand it from a city perspective. And it wasn't a combative role either. It's like, this group would have us do this, but we can't do that. And I was like, well, let's understand why they would have us do that, because in most cases people are just trying to get on. And that perspective is interesting. So for me, I very much approached that from a stakeholder courtship, if you like. And I was really keen to widen that out, almost to the point that I tasked civil servants with creating me a master stakeholder list that was as exhaustive as it could have been. And I made really good relationships with the justice family, including the judiciary and the police and all of that. And they were very, you hear this a lot, but they're risk averse. And, I nearly would have described it as, well, Minister, if it isn't broke, why not fix it? My response would be, well, it is broke, and why not? Because for me, public service should be always about improvement, not just sticking to what we always have done. And I think even now, and I see this outside looking in, they need to kind of look beyond the parameters that they've set themselves. And politicians, to be fair, have to empower them to do that too. And that means being in office. Yeah, look, in Northern Ireland, I think because of the nature of our politics, every political party has to get their say. Even the First and Deputy First Minister, one person will give their opinion on a subject, and immediately after the Deputy First will give their opinion. And it is quite similar in the Assembly, that we go from the largest party, which is Sinn Féin, to the DUP, to the Alliance, to the Ulster Unionists, and then the SDLP, and then eventually it filters down to the smaller parties, and myself as the Independent. And I think there's nearly an expectation then that I'm nearly a political party in myself. and that I need to have a view on everything and I need to take part in every debate because of that very strict sequencing. And that's not realistic for me. And I found myself certainly when I started out trying to be a voice on everything, but it meant that I spread myself very thin and people didn't really know what I stood for. And I think over the years I've tried to really lean in to what interests me, what my constituents need ultimately, because that's why I'm there. But also what I represent and can be associated with them. And indeed, when I started out, for me, that was actually older people, because, you know, if I wanted to be a good representative politician, who are the people I'm representing? And you only needed to take a cursory look at my constituency to know that most of the people that live there are older, or, you know, be classed as an older population. So for me, it was about representing them, and that started out with creating the Assembly's first all-party group for ageing and older people, to now hopefully progressing private members' legislation around age discrimination, which I hope will you know, positively impact their lives if we can get it on the statute. I think I always take it back to the people. You know, I was very conscious that when I was co-opted in 2014 that people didn't know who I was, and equally I probably didn't know them because I wasn't their representative and I wasn't elected into that role. So I made a really concerted effort to get out and meet them, and literally made lists of groups and organisations within my constituency and put them in the diary and met with them. And you know, a lot of people around the time of my first election in 2016 didn't think I would perform anywhere near as well as I did. You know, didn't feel that I would actually increase on my predecessor's vote, because he had had a career and a profile for 25 years. I had 2 years, you know, under my belt. So for me, it very much came back to the constituency and representation and doing the job that I believe that I was in that first instance co-opted to do. And I always come back to that. You know, this isn't an easy job. There's a lot of personal sacrifices. I don't do it for the money. I don't do it for the title. I don't do it for the profile. If anything, I'm quite a shy person by nature. I do it because I actually believe I can achieve something in terms of helping people. I don't always get it right. But at the same time, why do the job for any other reason?